break down into three parts. First, we're going to talk about what is long-run economic growth. How has the standard of living improved for people over the past 100 or several hundred years? Then we'll look at saving, investment in the financial system, and the important role that these have in helping long-run growth. And then finally, we'll look at the business cycle. So while over time, the standard of living tends to increase, despite that, there are still some periods where we see growth, some periods where we see contraction. So we'll break down the business cycle, trying to understand what that is. So people want the United States, wherever they live, to have a strong economy. Because having a strong economy, producing more goods and services, hopefully result in a better life for people. So we're going to break down what it means for an economy to be strong versus an economy being weak, talk about whether it's growing or shrinking, and what this actually means. So we'll start out with long-term growth, looking at growth over the long haul, and then we'll also do business cycle, so very short-term stuff. We'll hopefully get to, by the end of the semester, talk about a little bit about the Federal Reserve and monetary policy. They're primarily concerned with short-term growth, so smoothing out the fluctuations in the business cycle. So instead of having rapid swings of, an expanding economy, producing a lot more goods and services, hiring a lot more people, and then alternate periods where you have strong contraction. So a lot of firms are going out of business. You're seeing fewer goods and services being made, more unemployment. Federal Reserve tries to smooth that out over time. But they're less concerned about long-run growth, which is also something that's very important. Before we start, I have a video here to show you guys. This is economist Deirdre McCluskey, who focuses almost exclusively on this long-run growth.
The most important thing to understand about the modern world, actually, is that once people were very poor and now they're very rich. In 1800, the average person in the world made $3 a day. I mean, the modern equivalent of $3 a day. So the goods and services, the stuff you could buy in the amount of $3 a day. So 3/4 of a cappuccino per day, nothing else. In the last 30 years, the percentage of people who are that badly off in the world has fallen by half. It's been halved. So things are going very well. And for we in places like the United States, where they've gone exceptionally well since 1800, we're making, now hear this, $130 a day. And what a transformation. It's just incredible. Now, we had earned the $3 a day forever. So there was in history, if you want a short economic history, since the beginning of time, it was $3 a day going along like this. And then right here, which is 1800, it goes up like mad. And there's this fantastic transformation of the condition of ordinary folks. Why did it happen? One old explanation is exploitation. You hear this a lot. We are rich because there are a bunch of poor people elsewhere in the world who are poor. That's not true. There's always been exploitation in history, and it didn't cause economic growth. So it can't be modern exploitation. Nor can it be, to think of a more conservative way of looking at it, investment. It's not investment. It's not piling bricks on bricks or BAs on BAs. It's new ideas. It's innovation. The fantastic number of changes in machinery and materials and organizational ideas, such as the modern university or reinforced concrete. It's just amazing. That caused this hockey stick, the blade of the hockey stick. Why did this happen? Two changes in Holland and England in the 1600s and 1700s, which was a rise of economic liberty and social honor for inventors, merchants, manufacturers. Before, these were dishonored occupations, then they became honored. And out of that came a tremendous burst of innovation that had been earlier discouraged because they weren't free and they weren't honored.
McCluskey just finished a couple years ago her 3-part trilogy describing economic growth, breaking it down. Each of the books are over 700 pages long, and it's incredibly, incredibly dense. I got like halfway through one of them, but listened to a bunch of her talks on it because that's so much easier. She was an economist, like wrote a graduate level textbook all about like price theory, so very hardcore econ stuff, working with graphs and everything. But she loves literature, and the trilogy she wrote is going through all these different plays, basically trying to understand culture. So all these books that were written over like a 300-year period, showing about how cultural attitudes towards innovation and entrepreneurship changed from outright hostile to supportive, and tying that to economic growth. In the next chapter, we'll talk a little bit about the different theories of economic growth and what we think is the most important, or what economists think are the most important parts, causes of economic growth over the long term. Something she didn't mention the stat, but we saw an increase in the standard of living across the world of over 3,000%. So we've seen these massive, massive increases in the well-being of people. And this has a real translation, like this actually has an effect. When we talk about long-run growth and this 3,000% increase, we're talking about real GDP per capita. So we're adjusting for inflation, and we're talking about it for each individual person. Obviously, because populations change over time, it's important to account for those changes in population. So if you have more people, you're naturally going to have a higher gross domestic product. It also shows us what each person is actually able to consume, instead of just what the nation is able to consume. Yeah. So here's a chart from 1900 showing real GDP per capita. This is in 2009 dollars. So it's risen more than 8-fold in the United States since 1900. This is just for the US. So basically what it's saying is that Americans can buy more than 8 times as many goods and services. This 8-fold increase. And we see largely increases over time, but that's not always true. We have different periods of recession where material standards of living fall for a little bit before recovering and growing again. And that's the business cycle, seeing these short-term fluctuations. I don't know if an 8-fold increase in the standard of living sounds very impressive. It sounds like a lot to you guys, but the world in 1900 was almost unrecognizable. The US had the highest standard of living in 1900 in the entire world. Only 3% of homes had electricity. 15% had indoor plumbing, and 25% had running water in their faucets. So obviously there's going to be infrequent showering because of this. There's going to be very rarely washing clothes. There were a ton of terrible diseases that were still widespread, things like smallpox.
Is this when there was feces in the streets?
Yeah, there still would have been feces in the streets in 1900. Feces in the streets coming from horses, because horses were the means of travel at the time, and also because of lack of indoor plumbing, taking the chamber pot and really throwing out the window. That's just the saying, like, didn't have a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out. It's like they're really poor. That's kind of an old person phrase. I don't know if people say that nowadays. But like my grandparents said that when I was growing up. Yeah. And speaking of feces in the street, you had people with dysentery. That was very common. Typhoid fever was still common. And if that wasn't bad enough, even when you weren't sick, diets were super bland. And they weren't varied a lot. You couldn't get fruits and vegetables out of season, things like that. Life expectancy in 1900 was only 45 years in the US. It's right about 80 years now. Pre-COVID, I don't know what that's going to do to life expectancy. Well, mostly hitting old people, so probably shouldn't hurt it too bad. Yeah, little electricity, so there's no modern appliances. So if you're trying to take care of your house, you physically have to do everything. You have to wash all the dishes yourself. When you're washing your clothes, you're hand washing them, hand scrubbing them yourself. There's no vacuum cleaners. So if you want to clean off the carpets, you carry them outside and you beat them with that stick thing, and you put them back in. The amount of time we spent on housework in 1900 was, I don't have the exact number, but well over 40 hours a week. So this is literally a full-time job trying to take care of a house, because we don't have any of these labor-saving technologies that everyone has nowadays. So while we've seen this 8-fold increase in per capita GDP, the differences between today and between 1900, because of this increasing standard of living, because we have more goods and services available for us to purchase and use to make our lives easier, it's almost unimaginable. So while it sounds like we're just able to buy more stuff, it's really changed how people are able to live and made us so much better off. Almost doubled our life expectancy in 100 years and made each of those years even more enjoyable. So this is like important stuff. Have you ever had, I guess it would have been your great-grandparents that were alive in the Great Depression, right? No one's quite that old. My grandparent, my one grandpa he's what, 96. So he remembered the Great Depression. And just how difficult life was at the time is hard to even imagine nowadays. Yeah, so we think of like just GDP increasing or you see stock market going up. It seems like it's just something that either helps rich people or just gives us little things like to have a little bit of fun. But it's actually incredibly important for making sure people are healthy, happy, and living decent lives. And obviously, economic prosperity and health are going to go hand in hand. They're going to move the same way. When countries are richer, they can devote more resources to health. So either things like public health or things like research and development on new pharmaceuticals, and we can have more money to spend on treatments. Spending on healthcare and per capita income are very, very highly correlated. So as people make more and more money, they spend more and more money on their health. This shows some of the major nations, some of their increases in life expectancy. So you see the United States increasing over the past, 100 years? 115 years. See large increases in the UK and France, and then India, more than doubling their life expectancy over this time. So we see when we have these increases in real GDP, when we're able to produce more goods and services, it has a very strongly positive effect on our lifespan. Yeah.
Do you think that our life expectancy could like continue to go up with more innovation, or do you think we're like peaked?
I think we've pretty much peaked because our bodies just tend to like give out.
Yeah.
So there's talks about like gene editing and talks about other like things to like de-age our bodies. And if that was possible, then I can see our life expectancy still going up. But that's some serious innovation. That's not just like slight improvement. That's like revolutionary new technology.
Do you think we've reached a point because of like poor dieting and poor health choices of our generation that it might actually go down a little bit?
Well, it dropped in 2016 and 2017, just slightly. Maybe 2015 to 2016, I forget. Part of it was due to the opioid crisis, young people overdosing. And then there's some poor health choices. Because now we have more healthcare available. There's that moral hazard. I think we talked about that early in the class. Might have been 102, where we have, because it's now relatively less costly, because we have these treatments, people are like eating less healthy now. So I could definitely see that taking off some of our life expectancy. But because healthcare is so good, it's not going to do too much damage. But it'll decrease quality of life, especially near the end. Okay. Another connection with, or I guess another effect of economic growth and of prosperity is the amount of time you have for leisure. So as we grow more productive, as we are increasing our output, we don't have to spend as much time working. We have more time to relax with our friends, with our family, enjoying different activities. And obviously, as our lifespan grows, we have more time for leisure. So here we have Robert Fogel's amount of time spent in leisure. We see that increasing over time. So we have what, 1880 here. The lifetime hours of leisure was about 50,000 hours, and people spent about 175,000 hours doing work. I'll point this to you guys in case you can't see it, because the fonts are a little small. So very little time leisure, a lot of time working. By 1995, you see these flip. People spend less time working than they do relaxing, having fun, hanging out with their friends and their family. So this is a good thing. And he predicted that it would continue to increase. So we used to work 1880 about 60 hours a week on average. Now we work just about 40 hours a week on average. Those predictions can be a little tough, especially they made this prediction I think 2000. So looking 40 years in the future is quite a bit. But as we've seen over time, people are working fewer and fewer hours because they're becoming more productive. And there's a lot more good leisure that we can do. Leisure 100 years ago was like sitting around and playing cards or listening to the radio. Now we've got a million different movies you can watch, any second. We play video games that look just like real life. A lot easier to drive places. You go see a friend for a weekend instead of having to stay at home. But leisure is just a lot better now. So we'd expect to see more people, or people doing more leisure, saving more time for leisure, and working fewer hours. John Maynard Keynes predicted, writing in 1930, he said by the year 2000, we'll see people working, he predicted about 25 hours a week. So we're still working quite a bit more than that, more than his prediction. But he was right in the direction of change, that we're seeing fewer and fewer hours being worked. So not only are we healthier, but we get to have more fun when we experience prosperity. Okay. So when we talk about the growth rate for something like GDP, it's going to equal the change from one year to the next. So just very simply, if we have real GDP of 15 billion in 2013 and 16 billion in 2014. We want to calculate the growth rate. You take, I always remember it, is the percent change equals the new minus the old divided by the old times 100. So you take the first, or the most recent period. So we take 2014 in this case, subtract 2013, the first period, and then divide by the first period. So we can get that percentage change. And we typically use this going from one year to the next. So we'll look at the change from 2013 to the change, or to 2014. We won't look at 2013 to 2015 with just those two numbers. Just so you know, when we talk about percents, where that comes from. So if we go over a few years, we can take the percent change for each of those years and then average them together. If you're looking at short periods of time, like 2012 to 2014, then it's doable. But if you're looking over a lot of years, if you're looking from 1900 to 2020, that's going to be a lot of different calculations you have to do. So that's going to get pretty unwieldy. But it is possible to just average the rates of change for a couple years and do that math, fairly simply. It's something that works out. So if we're looking over longer periods of time, again, like I said, you're not going to average every single year. Calculate the change and then average them every single year. So you can solve for the growth rate. I don't know, this isn't super important. We're not going to be calculating this. But I kept this slide in because it talks about the rule of 70, which is something, I don't know, something that can be handy for you guys. So basically, anytime you can use this to figure out the time it takes for a variable to double. So you just divide 70 by the growth rate. So if our growth rate in a year is 5%, we divide 70 by 15 or by 5, and we end up with 14. So it'll take 14 years for, let's say, GDP. There's a GDP growth. If the growth rate is 5%, or average is 5% over that period, it'll take 14 years in order to double. So a very quick and dirty way to just be able to see when variables are going to double. If growth rate's only 2% a year, you divide 70 by 2, it's going to be 35. So it shows the difference, just how big of a difference small changes in percentage growth can be over the long term. Yeah, so just increasing growth rate from 1% to 2% cuts the time it'll take to double GDP in half. This is a particular concern to economists because we've experienced much slower growth since the financial crisis than we did in the lead up to the financial crisis. So GDP growth has stayed, or real GDP growth has stayed around like 1-2% since the financial crisis, where we've experienced, it was common to experience years of 3 to 4% growth in the couple decades before that. You can see over the long term, if it remains super low, it remains around 1 to 2% instead of 3 to 4%, this will have a large effect on our long run growth, even though from year to year, it doesn't seem like a very big deal. So that's why I wanted to talk about the rule of 70. So now what makes GDP per capita increase is labor productivity. So basically, labor productivity is the quantity of goods and services that can be produced by one worker or by 1 hour of work. So you just try to like standardize it. So the reason we can consume 8 times as many goods and services now than we did 120 years ago is because we're 8 times more productive. Workers are 8 times more productive than they were 120 years ago. So that's why economists care so much about innovation and why I talk about this so you guys are ready to gouge your eyeballs out. Because it's this innovation, it's these new ideas, that is what allows us to consume more, what allows us to live these better lives and to have more things. So the answer to what determines the rate of long-run growth, what has caused nations to become rich, is the same as what determines labor productivity growth. Again, why economists are so concerned about this. In Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, one of the first economics books, he basically started the field of study. His question is, the full title is an inquiry into the causes of the wealth of nations. He was trying to understand why some countries are rich and some countries were poor. And this is in 1776, so remember McCluskey's hockey stick of human development? The world was still very much poor back then. Even the rich nations were not well off at all. But even back then, people were starting to think, why are some places rich? Why are some places poor? The answer to that is labor productivity. We're able to produce more goods and services. That means we can consume more. So if you're concerned about growth, concerned about improving the standard of living, you want to focus on what is causing workers, what is causing firms to become more productive. You want policies to encourage that, not to discourage that. So there's a few factors that are going to affect labor productivity. These are some of the most important ones. So the first is increases in capital per hour worked. What capital is just goods that are used to produce other goods and services. So capital, if you own a pizza shop, would be like the pizza oven. Could be the car people use to deliver pizzas. Something that's used in manufacturing other goods, actually producing those goods or services. So they're not being used by consumers, they're being used by the people actually working. So there's two types of capital we can think of. Versus physical capital, which I just explained, the actual things being used. The other is human capital, which is basically your education, your training, the knowledge you bring. So when workers work somewhere in a certain industry or at a certain firm, they accumulate knowledge over time. They figure out the easiest way to do things. They become more skilled at it. And these are all human capital, so it makes them more productive. Your first couple days on the job, you're not going to get very much done compared to when you've been there, 20, 30 years. Also, physical capital, the more physical capital workers have, the more you're going to be able to produce in a given amount of time. So if a pizza shop has one pizza oven, they may be able to produce, say 10 pizzas an hour. But if they had like 3 of those ovens, they could produce 30 an hour. So when you have this more capital, you have more machines that you're able to use in the production of goods and services, you end up with increasing production. Which hopefully makes intuitive sense, that the more stuff you have to create these goods and services, the more you're going to be able to have. It was the idea that capital, that accumulating capital increases production, is how the free market got called capitalism. And that's what a name that Karl Marx gave to it. The second type, or the second factor affecting labor productivity, is technological change. So these are improvements in the capital, so actually getting better machines that we're using to produce these new goods and services, and it's better methods of producing these goods or services. So it could be, to use auto manufacturing as an example, it could be using new mechanized or like automated factories. So instead of having people on the assembly lines, you've got robots doing it, helping to produce more cars in a given amount of time. Or it could be a different method of production. So originally, they have a couple people work together on a car and build it up from like nothing. Henry Ford he came up with the idea for an assembly line, decided to switch over to it, and they have people perform 1 or 2 small tasks and move it on to the next person. That's one's kind of close to new technology too. So you could have different ways of organizing the firm and organizing production. Toyota had a lot of great advancements in management techniques throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which is why Toyota's, they threatened the US auto manufacturers so badly. They were so much better at producing cars than the US that it was GM, did a joint venture with them in California, so they opened up a factory together so that they could learn the management techniques that the Japanese companies were using, or that Toyota specifically was using. The new production methods, new management techniques are often overlooked by economists. We typically talk about improvements in the physical capital itself, which is extremely important, but new management techniques, better management techniques, are also just as important in increasing labor productivity and encouraging economic growth. And when it comes to these changes, whether it's a new method of production or improving the machinery we're using, entrepreneurs are critical. So having someone willing to take the risk, not just having the idea, but willing to put it into practice, is incredibly important to actually try these things. And remember, because of the profit and loss method, or profit encourages the adoption of these new things, the chance to be able to make a lot of money, encourages entrepreneurs to be willing to try these new ideas or these new methods. And the profit's a reward if they do change things for the better. If they change things for the worse, Loss filters out those bad ideas, the bad products, and encourages them to switch over to using the good ideas, the good products, the good methods, whatever they are. The last is property rights. So if you don't have property rights, a market system cannot function. So it's essential for the government to have not only a good court system, but to have fair laws that protect people's private property. Someone can come in and steal your stuff, steal your money from you. Instead of investing it, you're more likely to just hide it, to try to prevent someone from getting it. So these independent court systems, these fair laws that protect property rights, are essential for growth to occur. I don't remember if it was The Wealth of Nations. I'm thinking it was The Wealth of Nations. It might have been another book he wrote. Smith talked about buried treasure in England. Have I mentioned that in here yet? You hear about buried treasure in like movies, like old TV shows, right? And it wasn't just for pirates. Like he made some offhand comment that all the buried treasure in England would be enough to pay off the debt for like 2 or 3 years. And we like had like a discussion like about like I don't know, like several chapters at a time when I was in grad school. And I just raised my hand. I'm like, is no one going to talk about the fact that like he just casually dropped buried treasure? Because what happened is like these feudal lords, people that had money, didn't want their gold being taken from them. So instead of like investing it or doing something that they could just have it stolen later, they would just bury it on their estates somewhere. Obviously, they wouldn't tell anyone because you don't want them to know where it's at. That's the whole point of hiding it. But then they die without telling like their family members or anything. So there's just said there's all this unaccounted for gold just being buried in England because of these insecure property rights. Most economists consider property rights the precondition for any sort of labor productivity growth or long-run economic growth. That this is the first thing you need. Without that, the other stuff can't get you off the ground. Again, if someone can come in and just like take your money at any time instead of investing, I don't think I talked about Thomas Hobbes in here. When Thomas Hobbes, like an old historian, was talking about the pre-modern world, he talked about life being nasty, brutish, and short. It was like man against man. It was just people fighting each other and trying to steal their things and killing each other. When you live in a world like that, you have to, if you get any money, you have any additional output, you focus that on trying to protect what you have. When you establish a government that has secure property rights, that enforces them, that has an independent judicial system you can trust, you then don't have to spend all your money on defending what little you have. You can instead invest it in something. You can consume more because now you're secure in that. So it's incredibly, incredibly important to have secure property rights. So turning to a real world example, they asked the question, can India sustain its rapid growth? So for a lot of people, the incredible improvements in India was unexpected. So it was a British colony for quite a bit of time. From 1885 to 1947, so before its independence, there were incredibly low growth rates in India. Very little improvement in the standard of living in the country. From 48 to 91, so after their independence, the first 40 or so years, they had quite a bit of central planning. So they had fairly closer to a socialist government. The government dictating a lot of what should be produced, how it should be produced, those sort of things, who gets what. They had quite a bit of regulations, and there was a lot of corruption involved. And there's a lot of different layers of government. So not just you have to get approval to like start a new business from like one regulatory commission, you have to go through several like commissions. So there's a lot of layer of bureaucracy to try to get through, which again makes innovation extremely hard. But starting in 91, they adopted some market-based reforms. So they made it easier for entrepreneurs to start businesses. They scaled back some central planning, so there is more room for these firms to decide what to produce and how to produce. And they reduce some of the regulatory footprint. So again, you're allowing people to do more, giving them more options. And what we saw is the growth rate increased to about 4% from the first decade, 92 to 2002. And we've seen even stronger growth from 2003 to 2015, so over this next period, up closer to 7% growth. India still faces a lot of problems. They're seeing some of the best eradication of poverty in the world right now. This sucks, now I'm forgetting the number. This is an example I use like every time. But like the time it takes to say a sentence, there's like 100 people in India that are going from absolute poverty to above that line, which is just incredible to see this happening like right before our eyes. But there's a lot of problems facing India currently. So whether that growth will continue or slow down is still up in the air. There's still pretty bad infrastructure in the country, which makes it difficult for businesses to ship things. It makes it difficult for people to get around. So that can be a problem holding down growth. There's only so high you can get with some of these problems. There's still room to improve education that's being offered and to get as many people as educated as possible. The more educated the population, the better human capital, the more productive they're going to be in general. And there's some problems with commitment to rule of law they're facing. Most countries don't adhere to like a full commitment to the rule of law. There's always some willingness countries have to I don't want to say expropriate property, but they don't have perfect protection of private property. I'll say that. A pretty common thing in the world. So India is no different. Even in the United States, we have eminent domain, when the government can come in and take your property if it's necessary, if they deem it necessary, and they have to give you just compensation for it. But we use that not just for, like, the idea was basically like, if they, say they wanted to build a new road, and there were like 8 houses in the way. So if they bought 7 of the houses, if you were in that 8th house, you could hold out and refuse to sell in the house, and then they can't do anything, or you could force them to sell like a super exorbitant rate, like over what the market value would be. So they gave the government some leeway to step in and do that. But thanks to a Supreme Court decision in 2002, they granted, I think it was Connecticut, one of the states in New England, used eminent domain to buy a bunch of houses and sold to like a real estate developer to like put in like a mall or something. And the Supreme Court decided that if it like markedly like improved the property value in the area, that it was fine to use eminent domain. So we don't have perfect like protection of property rights in the United States, but still pretty good protection of property rights, which is important. I forgot they had potential GDP in this chapter, which is why we talked about the output gap last chapter. So you guys got like a free preview of this. So potential GDP is a level of real GDP that we can attain when all firms are operating at normal capacity. When we're talking about normal capacity, it's not firms, going to overdrive. Every worker is working double shifts. They're buying more capital machinery or anything like this. This is their normal production. So your normal workforce, normal hours, the capital you have now, not talking about them if they would, firms go out and buy more capital. So when the labor force expands, when we have more people working, potential GDP rises. Whether that's people who previously weren't in the labor force that are now in the labor force. So like from, 1960 to 1990-ish, when we saw the large increase in female labor force participation rate. It could be that, or it could be the population overall increasing. So just as more people are born, more people, there's more people there to go out and work. It can also rise when a nation increases their capital stock. So they increase the amount of capital they have that they're using to produce these goods and services, go potential GDP increase. And when new technologies are created, as we're getting these better capital machineries, you'll see an increase in potential GDP. So our growth of potential GDP in the US has been about 3.3%. So it's been growing at roughly a stable rate, around 3% for a while now. And here we see on the next slide the difference between actual real GDP and potential GDP. The difference between these two are the output gap that we talked about. So we had this output gap here for a while after the recession in the 90s. So we weren't producing at full capacity. Well, we could have been if we were using all the workers working normal hours. There's some periods where you can have a negative output gap, which again is bad. Sometimes you can have a positive output gap. So you've got firms, a ton of workers working overtime, things like that. You're expanding your labor force. You're hiring more workers than you normally do. You see the large output gap we've had since the recession in 2007 to 2009. So we see this lingering output gap because of the low GDP growth I mentioned earlier. All right, there's only a couple minutes left of class, and this is the new section. So we'll stop here for the day. Do you guys have any questions about this long-run growth that we've been talking about? We covered today? All right.